Tonight, you're not checking the time. You're sitting beside a cradle in a small Egyptian house, and the world is doing that quiet thing it does when it thinks nobody is watching. Before you fall asleep, you'll meet the 7 Hathors, the night goddesses who arrive like a soft audit of your entire life. You'll watch how midwives, mothers, in ordinary rooms try to negotiate with prophecy, and you'll see how one tiny household detail, milk, paint, a red lamp becomes a treaty with the future. A reed lamp breathing low, milk warming in a clay cup, a lullaby fitting into hush between heartbeats. Something nearby keeps time, not a clock, just breath and pulse slow and obedient. And if your breathing starts to follow it, that's perfect. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If nights like this keep you company, you can leave a like and subscribe only if you genuinely want to. And tell me where and what time are you listening from? Maybe that little lamp flame will remember you there, blinking patiently in your direction. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with pyramids, curses, or grand public gods. It begins with a room that has decided to be gentle, a lamp, a bowl of milk, a painted sign on mud brick, and the feeling that the future has slipped in quietly, taken off its sandals, and is standing politely at the edge of the cradle. In some Egyptian houses, people said the air around a newborn was thicker, as if even the future stepped inside to look around and then forgot how to leave. Tonight your mind is sitting in one of those houses. The room is small, mud brick, and careful, with a single red lamp making the shadows soft at the edges. Outside, a courtyard dog turns once in its sleep and sighs. Somewhere far off, the Nile shifts its weight in the dark. Inside, nothing is in a hurry. The story stretches out like a linen sheet being shaken gently over a bed, settling in slow folds around the cradle. The baby is only a few days old, still a little surprised at the whole breathing arrangement. Each inhale sounds tentative, each exhale sounds proud of itself. Her mother has counted so many of these breaths that the numbers have dissolved into a private song. Around the walls, quick painted eyes, little nets, and looping signs look on. They were added by relatives with strong opinions and weak handwriting. Some symbols are copied from temple walls, others from beer jars, and no one is completely sure which is which. Egyptian magic can be like modern user manuals. Everyone thinks they remember the instructions. No one actually keeps the papyrus. The house holds itself very still. Even the courtyard dust seems to have sat down. A bowl of milk, still faintly warm from the goat, waits on the floor by the door. A clay cup of beer keeps it company in case any thirsty divinity prefers something stronger. The lamp above them glows a dull red, turning the air the color of tired eyelids. Someone in the next room hums a lullaby that has forgotten half its words, but kept the important rhythm. You are safe. You are watched. You may close your eyes now. If you, listening far away, happen to stay awake for a while, you can always subscribe or follow or simply thank my story at the ceiling. The gods of the algorithm enjoy almost any offering. For the moment, you only have to breathe with the baby. The midwife is here, a small solid shape on a low stool. She has attended enough births to know when to bustle and when to become part of the furniture. Tonight, she has chosen furniture. Her hands smell of coriander and old linen. She watches the rise and fall of the tiny chest, listening the way fishermen listen to the river, not for words, but for anything that sounds wrong. Sometimes she straightens a blanket with the precision of a scribe adjusting one hieroglyph, so the god it names will not be offended. In a world full of storm gods and sun gods and crocodile spirits, her loyalty belongs to a much quieter power, the ordinary miracle of a child who keeps on breathing. It is in this small, over-prepared room that the 7 Hathors arrive. They don't bother with the door. Doors are for guests who worry about sand and gossiping neighbors. The Hathors slip in between one heartbeat and the next, like a thought you did not know you were thinking until it was already sitting down. If you could see them clearly, which is neither advised nor Necessary, they might appear as 7 women in dresses that remember the pattern of cowhide, or as 7 cows crowned with sun discs and jewelry that knows exactly how good it looks. On a sleepy night like this, they might be nothing more than 7 patches of perfume and moonlight standing loosely around the cradle, roughly goddess-shaped. They are not loud deities. They roll no thunder, topple no palaces, and almost never smite anything louder than a mosquito. Their importance lies in quieter work. The 7 Hathors are keepers of destinies, auditors of possible lives, the ones who lean over each newborn and murmur the fine print. Each of them already knows the baby's name, including the versions that were rejected after family arguments, and the secret nicknames no one has invented yet. Their arrival does not make the lamp flare or the walls shake. The only clue is that the silence changes. It feels ironed, smoother, like fresh linen laid flat on a bed. You might say they take 7 steps from the threshold to the cradle, but the packed earth does not notice any footsteps. Time notices instead. For a moment it stretches slightly, like cloth being pulled at the corners. The midwife rubs her arms, blaming the shiver on a draft she cannot find. The mother suddenly feels her tired thoughts lining up, unusually neat, as though someone has arranged them in rows. The baby frowns in her sleep, then relaxes again, small face rehearsing all the expressions she will one day use when adults ask impossible questions. The Hathors lean close. In some stories, they wear long braids threaded with tiny amulets against envy, fever, and unexpected storms. In others, they keep the clear, calm gaze of cows who have seen every kind of weather. Imagine them for yourself in the shape that feels most gentle, perhaps ant-like figures who always know where the good figs are hidden, perhaps soft-shouldered cows stepping carefully around the pottery. They smell, you decide, of milk that has just stopped boiling and of the cool air that belongs to the hour before dawn. When they speak, it is in voices more like linen rustling in storage than thunder. Egyptian texts say the gods decree a lifetime, but to your ears it would sound almost like casual conversation. The midwife hears nothing more than the house breathing. The mother hears only the echo of her own hopes, but the baby's bones seem to listen. Fate, in this place, is not written on some distant star chart. It is pressed lightly into the clay of a tiny spine while it is still soft enough to hold letters. Their sentences are short. The Hathors are not storytellers. They are annotators. One might say, simply, long life, and a tone like a line drawn calmly from one edge of the papyrus to the other. Another may add many journeys. A third, with a hint of amusement, might remark, loved more than she understands. They speak in images that fit inside a single breath. A road touching 2 borders, a field staying green through 4 floods. A voice that people obey, even when they are annoyed by how right it usually is. Sometimes the words are kind. We'll be surrounded by friends. We'll never lack bread. We'll laugh loudly and often. These fates glide through the room like small golden birds. Other phrases land heavier. We'll see the bottom of water. We'll live far from the place of birth. We'll lose what is most cherished and keep walking. The Hathors do not apologize. For them, destiny is neither reward nor punishment. It is simply the route laid out on a very large map. People are the ones who decorate that map with fear and hope, often on the same spot. A blessing can feel suspiciously like a trap when it names something you cannot escape. If the Hathors say a child will belong to the river, every bath, every ferry crossing, every summer when the Nile rises will carry an extra shadow. If they mention greatness, the house may rearrange itself overnight. Suddenly it seems important that the destined child sit in the good chair, that someone saved the best piece of bread, that every mistake be measured against the enormous yardstick of the word great. The goddesses do none of this themselves. They plant the seed and let human imagination water it with worry. So of course people try to negotiate. Egyptians were devout, but also practical. Whenever the gods made a statement, someone somewhere immediately began editing it with amulets. The first line of defense is the name. In Egypt, a name is a portable spell, a little banner the soul carries everywhere. If the prophecy seemed dangerous, the family might choose a name like safe or protected or beloved of reliable deity here. It is not subtle, but neither were the gods. If the Hathors promised good fortune, the parents might intentionally pick something modest, as if to say to fate, we appreciate the offer, but we're trying not to provoke the neighbors. Scribal records are full of people called things like, he establishes protection, and she whom the goddess saves, names that sound less like introductions and more like small negotiations shouted at the universe. Then come the objects. Over the cradle hangs a squat little figure of Bess, tongue out, beard bristling, eyes huge and comforting in their ugliness. He is the sort of household god who looks as if he has seen everything and laughed at half of it. Bess is good at scaring away things that prefer dignity. Nearby, a pendant of Tauret, the pregnant hippo goddess, waddles in faience. Her big belly and lion paws declare that nothing unpleasant will pass her snout. Little blue glazed eyes dangle from strings, watching for the barbed glance of jealousy. If a surface can hold a painted symbol, someone eventually paints one on it, then feels better. Hair becomes a conversation with destiny as well. A lock from the child's head might be cut, tied with a spell, and placed in a small jar to be opened on some future safe day. The famous side lock of youth is left growing, swinging as the child learns to walk, a visible label which says to friend and spirit alike, under construction, do not remove. Each year, someone redoes the knots, replaces worn amulets, refreshes fading paint. It is like updating an invisible contract. Same clauses, renewed signatures. Offerings follow a similar pattern of practical piety. The Hathors are known to enjoy bread, beer, and music, which makes them pleasantly easy to please. A mother may quietly set aside the first slice of a new loaf, steam curling up like unwritten words, and whisper, for the ladies at the cradle, who know what they're doing, mostly. If the fate-mentioned journeys, a tiny model boat might appear on the household shrine. If it mentioned wealth, a humble copper ring could be laid out as if to say, let's start with something manageable and see how we go. Through all this, the midwife returns now and then, moving at the edge of the family's story like a quiet priest without a temple. In the first weeks, she checks the child's weight, the mother's strength, the state of the household nerves. She listens to how people retell the night of the Hathors. Already the exact words are blurring, little gaps filled with guesses and wishes. Her task is not to correct the theology. Her task is to keep the baby from catching a chill while relatives debate metaphysics 2 rooms away. She gently redirects fear into routine. Wash your hands, keep the room warm, no arguing next to the cradle. Anxiety becomes a schedule. Superstition turns into hygiene. Time moves on, as it usually does when no one is watching too closely. The baby grows into a toddler who tries to feed amulets to the cat, into a child who knows which cupboard hides the sesame sweets, into a person whose knees and elbows are a map of tiny scars. The bowl of milk from the first night has long since been washed and used for lentils. The lamp has been replaced. The red paint on the walleyes touched up twice. The 7 Hathors have not returned in any obvious way, but their sentences travel along quietly inside the days. Memory starts to work like a second prophecy. The original whisper, whatever it was, becomes a story the family tells and retells, trimming and stretching it to match events. If the child grows up to marry someone from a distant town, the relatives nod, of course. The Hathor said she would cross waters. If instead she merely enjoys long walks by the canal, the same heads nod again. They meant her heart would wander. Fate, helpfully, is very good at retrofitting. Where life goes, the prophecy politely follows. Sometimes this reshaping is a balm. A loss might be wrapped in the gentler layer of "they warned us," as though advance notice made grief tidier, easier to fold and put away. A sudden piece of good luck becomes proof that the goddesses smiled. The messy human work of decisions and accidents and persistence gets tucked under the neat blanket of destiny. It is a comforting blanket, even if everyone knows, somewhere underneath, how many hands have been secretly rearranging it. Traces of the Hathors hide in objects and sayings. Perhaps there is a little stele in the courtyard, recording informal signs that once upon a particular year, a child's fate was spoken. Its edges are worn by sand and fingers. Perhaps there is a verse in a lullaby about 7 cows walking through the sky at dawn, each carrying a different future in her mouth. Grandparents might joke, when a child is stubborn, that one Hathor promised one thing, another disagreed, and the remaining 5 were too busy listening to decide. So the poor youngster has to keep all possibilities open at once. Meanwhile, life refuses to be impressed for long. Grain still needs grinding. Roofs need patching before the rare rain finds them. Market days come with their own small dramas about onions and prices. The notion that someone once looked ahead and traced out a line for this household becomes part of the furniture, reassuring but no longer urgent. It sits like an old cushion in the corner, familiar, a little faded, still comfortable to lean against on long evenings. And you, listening in your own quiet room, might feel your thoughts drifting toward your own beginning. Somewhere there was a night when someone stood over your sleeping shape and imagined futures for you. Perhaps not 7 goddesses, but parents, nurses, tired humans with hopeful eyes. Maybe none of them were exactly right. Maybe one of them said, "This one will stay up too late with stories." And here you are, proving them correct in the most relaxed way possible. The Hathors would probably approve. They have always liked people who take their time drifting between possibilities. There is no grand conclusion to this story, because fate in these Egyptian tales is less like a door that slams shut and more like a path that keeps going out of sight. In the baby's room, the red lamp burns lower, its light turning from rust to ember. The child sighs in her sleep and curls a hand around nothing at all, as if holding onto an invisible thread. The mother finally stretches out, letting her body remember what rest feels like. The midwife bundles her shawl around her shoulders and steps quietly into the paling night, already thinking about the next house where fear and hope will meet translating. The 7 Hathors, their work for this cradle finished, recede into the wide, listening dark. Somewhere a jar is sealed over a lock of hair. Somewhere a name is written carefully on a potsherd and placed in a box with others. Somewhere a song about 7 cows is hummed half awake, its tune a little crooked but still soothing. And somewhere very close to where you are, your thoughts loosen from the words. Your breathing finds its own slow rhythm, and for tonight, whatever the goddesses decided can rest quietly at the edge of your dreams. A small red lamp is doing its best to be a star. It breathes quietly above a clay cup where milk is turning warm and slow, making a tiny skin that will wrinkle if anyone stares at it too seriously. The room smells of soot, honey, and the last note of a lullaby that someone forgot to finish. Outside, a dog rearranges itself 3 times and decides this corner of the courtyard is the official place for dreams. Inside, the air is thick with the sound of one new heartbeat, still surprised to be in open air instead of water. You might not expect that the gods of destiny would bother with a room this small, but this is exactly the kind of place they preferred in Egypt. Important enough to hold a baby, ordinary enough that no one thinks to dress up for the divine. And if you stay with me, as long as your eyes feel like it, you can always drift off whenever you like. If you somehow remain awake all the way to the end, you can decide later whether the 7 Hathors have earned a sleepy little subscribe in your mind, or whether you'll just let their cows wander downstream with the rest of your thoughts. The walls of the house are busy even when everyone else is tired. Painted eyes look out from plaster, not dramatic or frightening, just slightly bored from staring at the same mat, the same basket, the same clay water jar every day. Nets are drawn in red lines where insects and bad luck are supposed to tangle. Knotted cords cross above the doorway like thoughts someone tied there and forgot to finish. A mother sits close to the cradle, counting breaths that come in tiny pairs, trying to decide when breathing becomes regular enough that she can relax her shoulders without feeling guilty. A midwife who has seen a great many first nights watches not the baby but the air around the baby, the way a fisherman watches water rather than fish. She listens for the small changes. When the newborn sighs become slower, when the birds outside give up and tuck their heads, when the neighborhood's last conversation finally runs out of complaints. It is the hour when myth and housekeeping overlap, when sweeping the floor and guarding the soul feel like the same quiet job. No one sees the door open, mostly because it doesn't. The space simply rearranges itself to make room for 7 new presences. The way your thoughts rearrange when a memory enters that you didn't call for. The 7 Hathors arrive as if they've always been standing there, perfume settling into the corners, gold not yet bothering to shine, faces soft with a kind of smile that knows too much and still shows up to work. Sometimes they appear as women, bracelets turned to keep from clinking, hair dark as river water at midnight. Sometimes, in other stories, they are cows with sun discs between their horns, enormous and gentle and taking up far too much psychological space in such a small room. Tonight they stand on 2 feet, but you can sense the cows behind their eyes, like a comforting backup plan made of milk and grass. They're not judges. They are more like accountants of the unseen, each carrying a ledger made of silence and probability, ready to enter one more line about one more human life. They do not apologize for the hour. The 7 Hathors keep a schedule that ignores human clocks. They arrive when the world is thin and the distance between one breath and the next feels negotiable. Outside, the courtyard's dust settles as if someone asked it to sit down and behave. A breeze that had been thinking about getting dramatic decides instead to pass gently under the door and listen. Dogs stop mid-scratch, tails hanging like punctuation, as if they're waiting to see whether anything edible is going to happen. The midwife feels the hairs on her arms rise in the same pattern they always do when the old stories become present tense. She lowers her eyes in the direction of the visitors, in the way midwives do when gods are in the room, but they still have to be practical about it. The mother notices nothing at all in particular. She only feels the cradle grow suddenly heavier, not with danger, just with meaning, as though someone had gently put a book of unwritten pages on the baby's blanket. The 7 goddesses circle the cradle with the unhurried precision of people who have done this for a very long time and have never once missed a shift. They do not speak yet. Instead, they count things that are not numbers. The softness of the baby's ears, the way a tiny hand forgets it is a fist and opens the warmth of the house, the number of protective symbols already painted and knotted and hung. This is not to decide whether the family is worthy. The Hathors are not in customer service. They are taking inventory, matching what humans have prepared on their side with the vague, complicated map of possibilities on the other side. A moth drifts between them, confused but not frightened, as if it has stumbled into an office meeting in which it is somehow both employee and agenda item. Finally, they begin to whisper. Their voices are level and practical, like people reading a recipe out loud. In Egyptian stories, the words of fate are rarely long speeches. They sound more like small, precise notes on how life will behave. One might say, very quietly, that this child will live long enough to see 3 floods of unusual generosity from the Nile. Another might mention that their feet will never learn to enjoy boats, which will surprise the family, given the number of relatives who work on the river. One will speak of work done with hands, another of love that arrives later than expected and brings more laundry than drama. The Hathors rarely bother with poetic metaphors here. Those come later when humans retell the scene. For the goddesses, prophecy is more like labeling jars. This one, courage, 3/4 full. That one, patience, arrives late but stays. Another jar, a certain weakness for honey cakes, non-fatal but noteworthy. Sometimes a whisper feels soft as linen. Sometimes it is sharp enough that the midwife's shoulders tighten. There is a famous story in which the 7 Hathors announce that a prince will die by crocodile, snake, or dog, which is a very thorough but not particularly comforting piece of information. Most families never hear anything so dramatic. At most, a quiet voice might say that the child is of short years, which everyone in the room pretends not to understand for a few very long seconds. If that happens, the midwife's hands move of their own accord, tucking extra amulets into the bedding, thickening the net of human effort around the God-given outline. But tonight, the goddess's tone stays level, like a balance beam that refuses to tilt. They speak of ordinary challenges. A chest that will wheeze in sandstorms, knees that complain before the rest of the body does, an impatience with lies, a habit of waking before dawn. Nothing cinematic, just the kind of details that, later on, will feel exactly right. The trick with the Hathor's speech is that every blessing is also a boundary, and every boundary hides a gift. To say that someone will be taken by the river can sound like pure fear if you only picture crocodiles, but in Egypt, the river also meant travel, trade, new jobs, and the occasional cousin who ran away and returned with better jewelry. To promise that someone will be great seems flattering until the family begins to think about school and work, and whether greatness comes with free afternoon naps or not. When the goddesses mention greatness, the house quietly turns itself into a workshop of pressure. Parents adjust how they hold the baby. Neighbors tell stories with extra adjectives, and one aunt immediately starts collecting tiny objects for when they are important, as if importance needs its own drawer. The 7 Hathors never explain their criteria. They drop statements like seeds and leave the watering, pruning, and occasional over-fertilizing to humans. It is possible they find this amusing, the way you might enjoy watching someone overinterpret a very simple text message. They do not laugh, though. They only let the words sink into the silence until the room feels wrapped, like a jar sealed with wax. When they are finished for this household, they do not vanish with a flash. They thin, like incense smoke moving away from its stick, stepping out of the room in a direction no one has painted yet. The red lamp goes on burning, quite unaware that cosmic paperwork has just been filed in its jurisdiction. After the goddesses leave, people do what people always do. They start negotiating with information that cannot be unheard. Families in Egypt began accumulating protective objects the way some homes collect mismatched mugs. Above this cradle, someone hangs a small plaque showing the 7 Hathors themselves, each with her cow ears and sun disk, as if the best way to soften a verdict is to display the judges on your wall. Base, the grinning dwarf god with his lion mane and sticking out tongue, takes up a post on a nearby bedpost, carved in cheap but enthusiastic wood. Tawret, the pregnant hippo goddess who looks like she knows everyone's business, stands in faience beside the water jar, wide-eyed and unblinking. None of these figures can technically rewrite what the Hathors have spoken, but they are excellent at making people feel that fate has company, which is sometimes almost the same thing. Names become another way to talk back to destiny. Parents choose combinations like Mary Amen, beloved of Amen, or Paude Bastet. Gift of Bastet, not because they think the gods will forget whose team the child is on without a name tag, but because saying the name every day feels like a tiny daily prayer. Some names are straightforward armor, proudly sharp. Others are modest, even a little deceptive, chosen in the hope that fate might be fooled by a low profile. Just a little one, a name might insist. No reason for crocodiles or history books to pay attention here. The idea that the universe could be tricked by clever phrasing is probably optimistic, but it makes breakfast conversations much more interesting. Offerings follow the same logic. A lock of baby hair might be tied in linen and tucked into a small shrine, not to buy more years outright, but to teach everyone in the house that offerings can be made. Bread, beer, a piece of meat from a festival meal, a few drops of perfume. These are set before household gods with the quiet hope that extra kindness may persuade destiny to bend around sharp corners. On certain days, the mother or father might touch the amulets and silently request a minor adjustment, perhaps a little less of the short knees prophecy this week, a little more of the patience with neighbors. It is less a negotiation and more like trying to sit more comfortably inside the shape of the life that has been described. The midwives in all of this become something like quiet priests of the first nights. They know the stories not as myths but as patterns. They have seen babies whose fates were whispered sharply and yet who laughed long, easy laughs for years. They have seen ordinary predictions turn into extraordinary lives simply because someone learned to read the fine print differently. When a family grows panicked over a particular phrase the Hathors used, it is often the midwife who shrinks it down to a manageable size. She may say, "It only means you should keep an eye on the river," or "many are called great." It doesn't say in what. Her voice turns prophecy from thunder into weather forecast, something to be aware of but not to worship. During the first nights, she sets rules in a calm, practical voice. Who may enter the room? How long the lamp must remain lit? Which stories are allowed to be told near the cradle, and which must wait until the child has teeth, or words, or a better immune system? If a prophecy felt sharp, if the Hathors hinted at hardship in a way that made everyone fidget, she keeps the household rhythm small and steady. Meals arrive like clockwork, visitors are filtered, arguments are moved to the courtyard. Boundaries become medicine, a start time and end time, a sense of closure at each day as edge, so panic has fewer open doorways through which to creep. Years pass. The baby becomes a child who objects to naps, then a person who has opinions about sandals and neighbors and how the bread should be baked. The first night with the 7 Hathors becomes a story told over and over, but like any story, it is edited each time it is spoken. Memory adds varnish, removes awkward details, and fits the ancient whispers to whatever life has actually done. A prophecy that seemed stern can be retold as, "They warned us, you know," in a tone that is half pride, half relief. A simple blessing can inflate into the goddesses smiled on you, especially if the person being addressed is listening from a position of comfort, ideally with a full plate. In some households, a lucky marriage, a good harvest, or an escape from illness is laid carefully at the feet of those first whispers. The Hathors smiled, people say, as if the goddesses have a customer satisfaction department. In other houses, a sorrow becomes evidence that the prophecy was accurate all along, even if the original words were vague enough to fit several decades of weather. Humans are gifted at retrofitting meaning. We could probably make an omen out of a drop spoon if left alone too long. The important thing in these retellings is that fate becomes a story people tell themselves, not a silent cliff they walk toward with their eyes shut. Temples and stelae keep more official versions. On stone, the story of the Hathors at the cradle may be carved with crisp outlines. In the year X of King Y, the 7 Hathors decreed. And yet even these inscriptions carry a gentle domestic feel. The gods of great myths, Ra sailing his solar boat, Osiris judging the dead, Sekhmet draining red beer instead of blood, take a step back here, making room for quieter divinities who slip into bedrooms like kindly, slightly overqualified aunts. Scribes copy these tales with the same care they give to laws and hymns, because in Egypt, the destiny of one child and the course of the sun were both worth good handwriting. By the time our imagined child is grown enough to understand the story of their own cradle, the 7 Hathors have probably visited many more houses. They do not keep track of reviews. They're interested in the long, slow movement of generations and how one whispered sentence turns into decades of decisions. And yet, if you picture them for a moment standing again in that first room, listening to the new heartbeat, glancing at the painted eyes and nets and amulets, you might sense a kind of cosmic fondness. They see not just one life, but the ripple of others who will be changed by this one. Friends, strangers, someone who will share a boat, someone who will bake the better bread recipe and never know why they were inspired to try. At the end of the night, when stories have been told too many times and even the gods are bored of hearing themselves quoted, what remains is something very simple. Parents still lean over sleeping children to watch their chests rise and fall. A red lamp, or its modern cousin, still keeps a small pool of light above a bed. Someone in almost every culture has a way of saying, "May your path be good," whether through a blessing, a lullaby, or an unnecessarily long name with 3 different protective deities squeezed in. Fate might be written in divine ink, but the everyday handwriting, the corrections, the doodles in the margins belongs to the humans who live it. So if you imagine yourself now, listening from your own room, you're not so far from that little Egyptian house. Maybe you don't have eyes painted on your walls, or a cow-headed goddess in the corner, though if you do, that's impressive interior design. But perhaps there is a lamp or a screen, humming gently, and a cup that has gone lukewarm while you were paying attention to other things. Maybe your blankets are a little tangled, like nets meant to catch bad dreams. Somewhere in the background, your own version of the 7 Hathors, the people who once told you what you might be, or what you should avoid, are whispering through old memories, their voices softened by time. You don't have to negotiate with them tonight. You don't need to correct their prophecies or find the exact right amulet in the catalog of your thoughts. For now, you can let their ledger close for the evening. Imagine that the goddesses have stepped outside to stand under the stars, discussing cattle and music and whatever else immortals use to pass the millennia. Inside, the room is yours. The air has the gentle weight of milk cooling, of incense becoming only a pleasant hint. You can choose one small protection for tomorrow, perhaps rest or kindness to yourself, or the bold decision to ignore the more dramatic predictions of your day and tuck it into the pocket of your mind as if you were placing an amulet beside your bed. The lamp dims. The house, whether it is in Memphis 3,000 years ago or wherever you are now, settles into its own breathing. The painted eyes on the wall, if there are any, seem to relax, content that nothing spectacular is required of them tonight. Fate, for the moment, can wait in its clay jar on the shelf, lightly sealed, labels facing inward. 7 patient goddesses, somewhere just outside the edge of sleep, keep their quiet watch, and the rest of the story long, ordinary. Strangely beautiful is free to unfold at whatever drowsy pace your dreams prefer. You might not expect a group of goddesses to specialize in baby gossip, but in Egypt there were 7 of them whose entire night shift was exactly that. They were called the 7 Hathors, and while the temples told grand stories about cosmic cows and golden music, the Hathors themselves were quietly busy visiting cradles. They did not arrive for coronations or battles. They came for the soft, slightly milky hour when a newborn's breathing is still deciding on a rhythm. Somewhere in the dark, a red oil lamp flickers like a cautious star, and a clay cup of warm milk develops a thin skin that will be declared ruined by someone in the morning. For now, the room is small, the air is heavy with sleep and incense, and the gods of fate are standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to whisper. If you stay awake, you can listen along. If you drift off halfway, the Hathors are very used to people not hearing the end of their sentences. The house is not particularly impressive. Thick mud brick walls hold back the night with more confidence than elegance. On those walls, someone has painted eyes that never blink and little looping nets meant to catch bad luck before it comes in. A few simple hieroglyphs for life and protection march along the plaster like serious little beetles. Read Matt's lie wherever bare feet will want to land in the morning. The roof beams creak softly as the night air cools them, a slow exhale from the day's heat. Outside, dogs have finished complaining about everything they meant to complain about, and now only shift their paws occasionally, dreaming of scraps. Inside, the world has condensed to a cradle, a lamp, a midwife, and a mother whose shoulders are carrying far more than the tiny bundle in her arms. The midwife knows the stories. She has heard about the 7 Hathors. She was small enough to be threatened with them if she refused to sleep. She has also seen enough births to suspect that if the goddesses exist, their sense of timing is oddly precise. They prefer, it seems, the moment after the last visitor has gone home, after the last "is it a boy? Is it a girl?" has been answered, after the house has stopped performing joy and has settled into the quiet, trembling relief of survival. Now's that time. The mother is half asleep, counting the baby's breaths the way someone counts waves, promising herself she will stop after the next 10, and never quite stopping. The midwife tends the lamp, adjusts blankets, and feels the hairs on her arms rise in a way that has nothing to do with the draft. No door opens. No dramatic light cracks the sky. The 7 Hathors do not need such entrance effects. They work in rooms already half-lit by worry. They simply are there, 7 presences arranging themselves around the cradle with the unhurried assurance of people who have done the same job since before anyone invented the word before. In some tales, they are women with braided hair and gold that glows like patient embers. In others, they are cows crowned with sun discs, vast and gentle, their hooves somehow not knocking over a single jar. Tonight you might imagine both at once. Tall figures whose shadows have horns, whose eyes carry the softness of animals and the calculation of gods. They do not disturb the sleeping baby. They only lean close enough that their voices, when they finally speak, will not have to be raised above a whisper. For a while, they do not say anything at all. They count. They count the knots in the protective cord over the doorway, the painted eyes on the walls, the number of times the mother glances up from the cradle to see if anyone else is watching over them. They count the midwife's steady breaths and the way her hands stay ready, still in work mode even while resting. They measure the room's warmth, the freshness of the incense, the thickness of silence outside. Like careful clerks, they compare all this with information you cannot see. The position of certain stars, the mood of the Nile in this particular year, the general willingness of crocodiles and snakes and sudden illnesses to mind their own business. It is all very administrative in a sacred sort of way. When they finally begin to speak, the sound is surprisingly ordinary. No echo, no booming, no choirs. Just low, calm voices, as if a particularly serious group of aunties were comparing notes. Their prophecies are not long speeches with metaphors piled on top of each other. They are short sentences, as practical as instructions on a jar. He will travel far on the water. She will live many seasons and see her grandchildren's grandchildren. His heart will love truth and dislike loud people. Her hands will be clever with cloth but clumsy with pots. Some details are striking. Some are almost disappointingly normal. The Hathors seem to prefer this. They are not in the drama business. They are writing a life in bullet points, even though no one in the room will ever see the list. Sometimes, though, one of them says something that catches in the air like a hook. Taken by the river, for example, is a phrase that has haunted many Egyptian bedtime conversations. It could mean drowning. It could mean being carried away in marriage or trade. It could mean a long career as a very competent boat captain who one day simply decides not to come back upstream. The gods do not specify. Another risky word is great. To tell a family their child will be great sounds flattering until everyone starts wondering what sort of greatness we're talking about. Great like a good scribe, quietly correcting everyone's spelling. Great like a general. Great like the person who invents a new bread recipe. The Hathors leave the term deliciously open, and the humans will do the rest. The goddesses know that every blessing can sound like a burden if you listen to it from the wrong side, so their tone is gentle, never dramatic. Still, as each line of destiny leaves their lips, it settles somewhere in the midwife's memory, in the mother's heart, in the child's sleeping bones. Now and then, one of the Hathors pauses, tilts her head, and adjusts the phrase as if nudging a pot slightly to the left, so it sits better on the shelf. These are minor edits in extra year, a soft edge to a difficulty, but they matter. The goddesses cannot refuse the shape of a soul that has been woven from elsewhere, but they can sometimes rearrange the furniture inside that shape, making room for a little more comfort. Once they have spoken, they do not explain their reasoning. They do not offer footnotes or suggested coping strategies. They simply fall quiet again, as if waiting to see how the humans will react. In most houses, of course, no one remembers the exact wording later. People are tired, milk spills, someone sneezes. Years pass. The sentences the Hathors spoke become more like impressions than quotes. Yet for this moment, in this room, they shine with the crispness of new ink on papyrus. The 7 Hathors exchange one look between themselves that says the meeting is concluded. Then they step back into the folds of the night, leaving behind nothing visible except perhaps a slight strengthening of the lamp, as flame and an inexplicable feeling that the room is slightly fuller than it was. As soon as the goddesses go, humans start improvising ways to respond. The family might not remember each word perfectly, but they remember enough to begin the long, slow art of negotiating with fate. One of the simplest methods is decoration. A little wooden image of a Hathor with cow ears is hung above the cradle, just in case seeing herself reminds the goddess to be kind. This, the dwarf god with his lion mane and protruding tongue, joins the party as a guardian against nightmares. Tarit, the hippo lady who protects mothers and children, appears in faience, wide-eyed and unapologetically round. It becomes a small crowd of divinities staring down at a very small person, like an audience assembled far too early for a performance that has barely started. Then there are names. In Egypt, naming a child was something like writing the first line of their biography in big permanent letters. Families choose carefully, Hori, the distant one for someone expected to travel. Merit, beloved for a child everyone already adores. More elaborate combinations like Hori Imheb, Hori and Festival for hopeful parents who want joy woven right into the syllables. Sometimes a name is chosen specifically to nudge destiny in a certain direction. If the Hathors hinted at danger near water, perhaps a name that ties the child to a protective deity of the river will soften that. If they mentioned greatness, maybe a modest-sounding name will keep expectations from overheating. It is like trying to negotiate with the universe through creative paperwork. Amulets become another layer in this quiet argument. A tiny Wadjet eye, the protective eye of Horus, is tucked into the child's wrappings. A small shell or bead containing a scrap of hair is knotted and unknotted on significant days, a reminder that even if fate is written, certain lines can be emphasized or underlined. Bread and beer, the 2 most stubbornly ordinary things in Egyptian life, are offered at little household shrines with a seriousness that would impress any temple priest. We have heard what you said, these offerings imply, and we are not saying you're wrong. We are simply offering you carbohydrates in exchange for slightly improved terms. In all of this, the midwife becomes an interpreter between myth and flesh. She is the one who knows which tales are worth taking seriously and which phrases are simply traditional. When an anxious grandmother insists that taken by the river definitely means something awful, the midwife may gently point out 3 different neighbors whose lives improved considerably when they moved downstream. When talk of greatness gets out of hand and someone starts planning a monument, she may remind them that being the best baker in the village is a kind of greatness that feeds people without attracting crocodiles or tax inspectors. Her work is part medicine, part theology, and part crowd management. She also sets rules for the first nights, and these rules are quietly magical. Who may enter the room and when. How loudly people are allowed to talk near the cradle. Where shoes must be left outside. These might seem like simple matters of hygiene and politeness, but in a world where fate has just been discussed out loud, boundaries become a way to make the invisible feel manageable. The midwife knows that panic is contagious, so she keeps the household rhythm slow and predictable. Meals arrive when they are supposed to. Lamps are refilled before they sputter. Cries are answered, but not with alarm. If the Hathors have predicted some difficulty, the midwife's routine becomes the scaffolding that will hold the family steady around it. Years unfold. The child grows into someone capable of knocking over the very shrine that was meant to protect them, because that is what children do. The story of the night when the 7 Hathors came becomes family lore, told around bread, told in the courtyard while grinding grain, told to future spouses who may or may not pretend to be appropriately impressed. With each retelling, the prophecies blur and sharpen in interesting ways. A vague comment about travel becomes, they said you would cross deserts. An observation about clever hands turns into, they promised you would be a great scribe, even if the original phrase could just as easily have meant good at untangling rope. This editing is not necessarily dishonest. Humans are very good at reading their lives backward, connecting dots that were never meant to form a picture. When something fortunate happens, a narrow escape, a lucky job, a good harvest, the family may recall the Hathors and say, they smiled on us. When something painful happens, the same story can be used as comfort. They warned us, someone will say, as if having been told long ago makes the present hurt slightly more organized. Fate becomes not just a decree, but a narrative tool, a way to make a messy existence feel like it has chapters. Meanwhile, in the formal world of stone and ink, scribes carve and copy more official versions of what the 7 Hathors do. Tomb walls show them in neat rows, sometimes as women, sometimes as cows, sometimes perched in a sycamore tree like patient, overqualified birds. Texts mention them by name: Hathor of Thebes, Hathor of Heliopolis, Hathor of the desert, each with her specialty, as if destiny were managed by a team of regional managers. Stili asked them to speak well of the deceased, to testify that this person lived as they were meant to live, more or less, given the usual complications. It is a very polite bureaucracy of the soul. Back in many small, unrecorded houses, the practice of taking bedtime oaths grows quietly out of these beliefs. Parents say things like, "Sleep well, little one. May the 7 Hathors speak kindly over your pillow," or simply, "Dream soft, wake strong." Children, who have heard fragments of the Cradle story, invent their own negotiations. They might whisper to the ceiling, promising to be good tomorrow, not today, if only a specific fear does not come true. There is a sense that words spoken at night between wakefulness and sleep join the same stream of whispering where the goddesses once spoke. It is not theology. It is habit as natural as tucking in a blanket. And you, listening now, are not so far from those houses. You may not have painted eyes on your walls, though perhaps the dark shapes of furniture do something similar, watching over you without comment. You probably do not keep a hippo goddess on your nightstand, though a favorite object, some little figure or stone or very tired houseplant, might be working as an unofficial guardian anyway. The room you are in has its own version of the red lamp, whether it is an actual lamp, a phone screen dimmed to almost nothing, or a glow sneaking in from a street outside. Somewhere nearby, the soft sound of your own breathing is doing exactly what that Egyptian baby's breath did, marking the pace of a life that will later be described in sentences much shorter than the years they cover. If anyone ever told you what you were destined to be by horoscope, by personality test, by a particularly dramatic relative, you have already met your own version of the 7 Hathors. Their words may still drift around in your memory, sometimes comforting, sometimes annoying, sometimes strangely sticky. The Egyptians would say that such sentences are seeds, but not the whole plant. What grows depends on weather and soil, and how often someone remembers to water with kindness instead of worry. Tonight, you do not have to sort out which predictions were fair and which were nonsense. You can let them line up quietly in the background like 7 distant silhouettes at the end of the room, minding their own celestial ledgers. For now, the only oath required is a very small one, that you are allowed to rest regardless of what was once whispered about you. The old stories like to imagine fate as something decided all at once, but even in Egypt people knew that most of destiny feels like a series of small everyday choices. Whether to share food, whether to listen, whether to let a fear rule the evening, or just sit beside it and watch it fall asleep first. You can choose, in this particular night, to let your thoughts behave like that red lamp's flame, steady low, not very interested in grand decisions, just committed to staying lit until morning. So picture, if you like, the 7 Hathors finishing their rounds for the night. They walk along the invisible corridors between houses, comparing notes about babies who all look equally wrinkled to them, giggling quietly over fathers who nearly fainted and grandmothers who tried to bribe them with extra incense. Their cow forms, when they choose them, leave no hoof prints, only a faint warm smell of hay and sunlight. They step out beyond the last rooftop and stand for a while at the edge of the desert, watching the stars rearrange themselves in the slow dance that only immortals have the patience to follow. Then they turn back toward the world of sleepers, where countless small rooms like yours are settling deeper into stillness. In one of those imagined rooms, yours, you shift under your own version of linen, perhaps less perfectly woven, but equally determined to be a barrier against drafts and worries. The air cools just a little, sounds recede. Whatever has been written about your life, by gods or people or your own earlier self, can wait until another time. Tonight, the story pauses at the cradle, at the point where the lamp burns low and the goddesses have already spoken and gone. Nothing more is demanded of you than the simple ancient act that even the smallest Egyptian child eventually mastered, closing your eyes, trusting the night to hold you very gently and letting the whispers fade into a softness where words are no longer needed at all. By the time the lamp has burned down and the baby from that first night is old enough to steal dates from the kitchen, the actual words of the 7 Hathors have already started to blur. No one can quote them exactly anymore. Memory in an Egyptian household behaves a little like the Nile in flood season. It keeps the same direction, but the edges shift, swallowing a little field here, leaving a little island there. What remains clear is the feeling of that night, the sense that 7 unseen auditors of destiny once stood around a cradle and said something quietly important. The family carries that feeling forward, the way people carry a tune from a song but forget the lyrics. They hum fate instead of reciting it. And if you are still awake as we drift through their years, you're welcome to stay with them. If you fall asleep halfway, the Hathors will assume you are simply being efficient and will not write you up in any cosmic report. As the child grows, each small event becomes an excuse to test the old prophecy, whatever anyone remembers of it. When the child takes their first unaided step, toppling toward a basket and landing with both hands firmly planted, an ant says, they said this one would stand firm. No one is entirely sure if that was actually said, but the moment feels like confirmation, and confirmation is comforting. Later, when the child shows an early love for water, splashing happily in the washing basin while adults pretend not to worry about taken by the river, the memory of the Hathor's words is trimmed delicately. Perhaps someone suggests the phrase had meant loved by the river instead. It would be a shame, after all, to waste such clear joy on fear. Stories about the night of the prophecy become more polished every time they are told. The midwife's steady presence, the smell of incense, the exact color of the lamp's flame. Each detail is sanded to a soft glow in retelling. Certain lines are promoted to importance. They said this child would be clever with hands, a grandfather insists, because the child has just mended a broken toy basket with impressive patience. No one remembers the part about being clumsy with pots until a jug is dropped years later, and then the forgotten clause resurfaces with triumph. Ah, they told us that too, someone says, smiling in the way people smile when a minor inconvenience proves a story true. In this way, memory becomes a second prophecy laid gently over the first, like a fresh papyrus glued atop an older document. The new layer does not erase the old writing, but it does decide which strokes show through. A lucky harvest, an unexpected friendship, a narrow escape from sickness, all of these are retroactively filed under the Hathors smiled. A disappointment, a lost opportunity, a broken engagement become they warned us. The same set of original words, half remembered, can be arranged to support nearly any conclusion. The Hathors, who have watched human beings do this for centuries, are unlikely to be offended. They are used to mortals operating like scribes who take dictation from the gods, and then quietly add footnotes in the margins. Sometimes the second prophecy is kinder than the first. A phrase that once sounded harsh gets soft by context. If the Hathors spoke of hard work in their Cradle verdict, years later the family may describe it as a strong spirit when telling the story to the grown child. They said you would not be spared effort, a parent might say with affectionate pride. And look at you now, carrying twice your load. At other times, memory sharpens things. A vague mention of travel can evolve into, they said you would cross deserts and seas, especially if anyone in the line ever walked a little farther than usual or took a ferry to visit relatives on the opposite bank. Each generation edits the narrative with practical needs in mind. If the family requires courage from the young adult standing hesitantly at the threshold of marriage, the old cradle prophecy will be recited as a guarantee of strength and loyalty. If they need that same adult to show humility, the prophecy will be emphasized as a reminder that greatness carries heavy baskets, not just heavy crowns. Fate, in everyday use, becomes less like a verdict and more like a particularly flexible proverb, rearranged to suit the moment. It is not that people do not believe in the original words. It is that they have learned to talk to those words, to lean on them, to use them as a handle for things that might otherwise feel too slippery to hold. Objects in the house quietly participate in this remembering. A little clay statue of Hathor, once hung over the cradle, is moved to a shelf as the child grows, then to a niche near the doorway when the child begins to come and go independently. The goddess acquires new responsibilities in the family's mind, guardian of journeys, supervisor of curfews. A knotted cord that once circled the cradle now wraps around a bundle of letters or a small chest, tying the idea of protection to possessions instead of sleep. The same amulet that was first meant to guard against fevers is later thought to ward off bad business deals. The physical objects act as bookmarks in the story of the prophecy, reminding everyone where they last felt sure of its meaning. There is a gentle humor in how seriously people take these markers. Someone misplaces the Hathor statue during a busy cleaning day, and for an hour the house is filled with uneasy jokes. Well, if anything goes wrong before we find her, we'll know whose fault it is, a brother mutters, knowing full well that his own clumsiness is a more likely culprit. When the statue turns up behind a pot, dust on her ears, she is cleaned carefully and given a slightly higher position on the shelf, as if promotion can compensate for the brief neglect. The goddess herself, if she notices, probably appreciates the upgrade. Humans, she knows, pay more attention to things they have just lost and recovered. For the person whose life was whispered over, all of this can feel like standing inside a room where the wallpaper is made of expectations. On good days, destiny is flattering. On difficult days, it can feel like a second job. When a choice presents itself, take the apprenticeship in the busy town or stay and tend the family store. The old phrases murmur in the background. They said you would travel, someone reminds them. They said your hands would be clever, says another. The decision still belongs to the living person, of course. Fate in Egypt was rarely imagined as rigid shackles. It was more like a set of currents in the Nile. You could push against them, but you could also use them if you understood their flow. After many such decisions have come and gone, the original Cradle story acquires an almost ceremonial place in family gatherings. It might be told at weddings, with the implication that the Hathors are being consulted again, this time regarding two intertwined paths. It might be told after a funeral, not as proof that it was meant to be, but as a way to say, we noticed every detail of this life from the first breath to the last. In these retellings, the memory prophecy becomes an instrument of tenderness. It allows people to say, you mattered so much that even the gods took notes, and to believe it. Somewhere along the line, another custom grows out of all this revising and retelling, the habit of speaking small O's at bedtime, aimed not at changing the past prophecy, but at cushioning the future around it. These O's are modest. No one tries to negotiate entire destinies in one night. Instead, they choose manageable wishes, like choosing tasks for tomorrow's list. May the child sleep without fever, a mother murmurs. May we have enough bread? May the boat not leak? They may add a respectful nod to the 7 Hathors. Guide us as you will, but the tone is not demanding. It is conversational, like talking to neighbors who happen to live in the sky. In houses with several children, these oaths become a kind of playlist, repeated so often that even the smallest ones can join in, half whispering, half yawning the key phrases. Health for everyone in this room. No bad dreams. Let the important letters arrive where they are supposed to. The requests are practical, almost bureaucratic, which probably pleases deities accustomed to dealing with cosmic ledgers. From the outside, it might look like superstition. From the inside, it feels like a way to tuck the family's worries into neatly folded piles before sleep, so they do not spill all over the night. The Hathors, according to quiet temple traditions, are not offended by such human paperwork. In fact, certain texts hint that they welcome offerings of intention as much as offerings of bread and beer. A small habit repeated nightly can, in its own way, nudge the shape of a life. If a family says often enough, may we be kind to one another tomorrow, they are statistically more likely to notice when they are about to be unkind. This is not magic in the dramatic sense, just basic cause and effect wrapped in incense smoke. The gods provide the image of order. Humans supply the daily practice, one sleepy promise at a time. Over the years, people also learn to make oaths not only for protection, but for perspective. A farmer with aching shoulders might say at bedtime, "May I remember that work is easier than fear." A scribe with tired eyes may whisper, "Let mistakes be small and correctable." These are not guarantees. They do not remove hard days. They simply offer a different lens through which to see them, much like the way memory offers a softer view of the original prophecy. Fate, filtered through these nightly promises, becomes less about what cannot be changed and more about how to meet what comes. Eventually, the person who once lay in the cradle becomes the one standing over a new cradle, listening for echoes of hoofbeats that never quite reach the ear. The cycle repeats. The red lamp, the scent of warm milk, the painted eyes on the wall. The stories about their own Hathor night come to their lips almost automatically. When you were born, someone tells them, the 7 Hathors said, the details may have shifted again, polished by time, but the core remains. You were noticed. You were spoken over. Your life is held within a story larger than this single sleepless night. Standing there, they may realize something their parents and grandparents did not always say out loud, that the most powerful part of the tradition is not the prediction itself, but the careful attention it inspires. Because of the Hathors, people watch their children more closely. looking for signs of genius or grace or a particular affection for water. Because of the Hathors, they remember to tell stories, to mark turning points, to keep a narrative thread running through years that might otherwise feel random. Fate, in this sense, is simply love that has been organized into a timeline. You, listening now, can borrow this without needing a painted cow goddess on your wall. You may not believe in deities filing reports about your dreams, and that is entirely acceptable to them. The Hathors have dealt with skeptics for a very long time. What you can keep is the practice of the bedtime oath, scaled down to the size of your own evening. It does not have to be grand. May tomorrow be one step softer is enough. May I remember one good thing works perfectly. If you feel very awake and ambitious, you might add, may I be gentle with myself when I forget these things. The gods, if listening, will understand the tone. Think of memory as a kind of household shrine where you keep not only what happened, but how you tell yourself what happened. Tonight, as you lie there, you can rearrange a few of those internal statues. Perhaps a moment you've labeled failure could be moved to a shelf called practice. Perhaps a phrase someone once tossed carelessly your way could be dusted off and put in a box labeled no longer useful. This is not pretending the past was different. It is doing what Egyptian families have done for centuries with the Hathors' words, trimming them to fit what actually unfolded, widening them where kindness allows so they hold rather than hurt. In the quiet that comes at the end of the day, your breathing measures the room the way the midwife once measured the night around a newborn. Inhale, and you gather all the scattered thoughts, the errands, the worries, the half-finished conversations. Exhale, and you let them line up at a polite distance, like relatives waiting outside the cradle room until visiting hours begin again tomorrow. Somewhere in that space, you can imagine 7 very patient figures standing around your bed, not to dictate your destiny in intimidating prose, but simply to witness that you have made it through another cycle of rising and falling lamps. They might note in their ledgers, small but significant things, showed kindness despite being tired, survived a day that once looked impossible, still breathing, still curious enough to listen to stories about ancient cows in the middle of the night. Beings who have watched empires rise and crumble like sandcastles. Such entries are more interesting than you might think. Grand events repeat themselves. Quiet perseverances are always slightly new. As the room grows darker or lighter, depending on when you are listening, the story we have been following does not need an ending. The child in the ancient house will go on to live a life full of days that we could catalog forever, and the 7 Hathors will keep making their rounds, adjusting destinies with the delicacy of people folding linen. Your own nights will continue to arrive at regular intervals, each one offering the same small opportunity to let memory be a second, kinder prophecy, and to speak one soft oath for the future before sleep. Maybe tonight that oath is as simple as, let me rest. Maybe it is, let tomorrow's worries wait until tomorrow. The lamp of your attention can grow dim now. The painted eyes of furniture and shadows can take the first watch. If you drift off in the middle of forming your sentence, that is perfectly acceptable. In households all along the Nile, people have been falling asleep halfway through their prayers for thousands of years. The gods are used to the sound of unfinished words fading into steady breathing. They know that, of all destinies worth honoring, the chance to close your eyes and be carried gently into dreams is one of the quietest and one of the most precious. You might not expect the god in charge of shaping human bodies to keep night hours, but Khnum, the ram-headed potter of the Nile, is famous for working when everyone else is trying to sleep. Somewhere between the last frog's croak and the first rooster's opinion, when the air over the river is just cool enough to pretend the day never burned at all. He is said to sit at his wheel and nudge destinies a little to the left or right. Not with dramatic gestures, not with thunder or trumpets, but with the same patient motion a village potter uses when straightening a slightly crooked rim. If you're still awake a few minutes from now, you can decide whether to keep listening like a quiet inspector on the night shift, or let your attention slip off the shelf like a sleepy clay cup. Either way, the wheel goes on turning. Imagine the island of Elephantine in the middle of the Nile. By day it is busy and practical, quarry shouting dust into the sky, scribes counting boats that pass the cataracts, priests minding the temple of Kmum with the serious faces of people who know that keeper of the floodgates is not a job you want to mess up. At night, though, the island exhales. The granite turns dark and soft. The river pulls a thin shawl of mist over its shoulders. Lamps go out in the small houses wedged between walls and gardens. Somewhere, a dog rearranges itself 3 times before committing to sleep. The only steady sound is the river's low dialogue with its own banks. Inside Kmum's temple, the official doors are closed, but the mythic ones politely ignore human schedules. They open sideways like the lids of jars in a story and lead down to a workshop that most people never see. It is not a frightening place. It smells of wet clay and cold ashes, the way a potter's courtyard does after the kiln is cooled. Shelves line the walls, holding thousands of small forms you wouldn't notice at first glance, tiny figures half-shaped, like thoughts that pause to yawn. Coils of clay twisted into the beginnings of spines. Miniature hands waiting patiently for someone to decide whether they will be good at farming, or at counting, or at losing important objects and then finding them in obvious places. Kmum sits at his wheel in the middle of this quiet room. The wheel turns slowly, as if time itself were being polite. In some stories, he shapes the bodies of children before they are born, pressing eyes and ears and fingers into place. In others, he also shapes their casts, their vital doubles, like a spiritual second draft. Tonight, he seems to be doing both at once, which sounds complicated, but is really just multitasking with clay. The ram's curling horns catch a bit of prophetic starlight from the open roof. His hands are broad and sure. You might expect a god of creation to work in great bursts, but Kmum is more of a steady rotation type. No drama, just circles. On the wheel there is a small, damp figure that looks very much like anyone you might see walking through a market. Not a hero, not a villain, just a person. Kmum smooths the shoulders, considering. Should this one be good with numbers? He presses a thumb gently into the chest, not too deep. A talent, not an obsession. No need to turn them into a walking abacus. Should they be afraid of deep water? He flicks a thin ring of clay away from the ankles. Perhaps only a respectful caution, the kind that keeps people from jumping into unknown currents after sunset. Somewhere years from now, a person will stand on a riverbank and say, "No, I'll wait for the boat," without knowing that this choice began as a tiny adjustment on a divine potter's wheel. The shelves around him hold older projects. You can almost read the work history of humanity in them. There are sturdy jars labeled with invisible ink, patient farmers, reliable midwives, scribes who secretly enjoy sharpening their reed pens. There's a shorter row for people who can fall asleep quickly, which you may eye with a certain envy. Timon touches them sometimes as he passes, checking that the clay of their destinies has fired correctly. Every so often he finds a piece that leaned too far in the kill, someone whose courage hardened into stubbornness, or whose carefulness became worry. When that happens, he does not smash the jar dramatically. He simply sets a new lump of clay on the wheel, a friend, perhaps, or a teacher, or a city that will give them different streets to walk. Creation for him is often a matter of context dot in another corner of the workshop. There is a tray of unfinished bits that look like spare parts from very specific kinds of days. Half a laugh, a shard of concentration, 3/4 of an apology. These are not mistakes. They are leftovers. When Kmum formed a particularly clever architect or a very patient grandmother, He sometimes had small portions of qualities remaining, the way you might have a spoonful of lentils left after filling all the bowls. It would be wasteful not to use them, so he shapes them into little additions he can press into other lives when he has a quiet moment. Somewhere in the world, a child who expected to be merely average at music will wake up one morning with just enough extra curiosity to try the system again. Another person will find that they are suddenly slightly less afraid of asking for help, as if someone has smoothed the rough edge of that feeling in the night. Asterisk. If you listen closely, you can hear another sound in the temple besides the wheel's whisper and the settling of shelves. It is the faint scratch of a reed pen. In the human part of the building, a single scribe is finishing a tablet for the day, a record of births, perhaps, or a list of offerings promised if the flood behaves itself. The scribe does not know exactly what Gnome is shaping downstairs, but they have copied enough hymns to suspect that somewhere beneath their feet a divine workshop is active. So they write carefully, keeping their lines straight. It is a quiet kind of cooperation, clay below, ink above. The god forming possibilities, the scribe giving them legible addresses dot by the time Knum lifts the next figure from the wheel. The world above has moved on by a fraction. A small insect has decided to explore the rim of a water jar. A cat has tested the stability of a pile of laundry and found it ideal. On the horizon, the star Soptit, which people will later identify with the goddess of the rising Sirius, has shifted a barely noticeable distance. Tim presses his thumb gently into the little clay head, deciding how much memory this person will have for their dreams. Not too much. The gods have seen what happens when mortals remember every detail of every night. No one gets anything done, but enough for the occasional lingering image to nudge them toward a choice. A boat they once saw in a dream might later feel familiar enough that they trust it. A field might feel like a place they've already loved. Above the workshop, houses near the temple have their own clay stories. In one of them, a human potter leans over a wheel that looks in miniature, very much like Nom's. The potter doesn't know about the god's current projects, but they have heard the myth that Khanum shapes people as if they were jars. It is a comforting idea. Jars are fixable. If a rim chips, you can file it smooth. If a pot cracks but does not shatter, you can patch it with careful hands and a good slurry. So when the potter's child asks in the dark whether people can change, the answer is simple. Of course. The god made us from clay. Clay remembers how to be moved. Somewhere below, Knum smiles without interrupting his work. This human workshop is noisier than the divine one. There is the slap of wet clay, the soft hiss of the wheel, the tiny argument of siblings over who will carry which finished bowl to the shelf. Hanging on the wall is a small figurine of Knum, carved from wood and painted with simple lines. His horns are slightly uneven, giving him a permanently quizzical expression, as if he is always asking whether this particular clay body really needs another cup of beer. People touch the figure for luck before starting a difficult piece. The god, who has received far more elaborate offerings, finds these quick taps particularly endearing. The family's pots travel everywhere. Some end up in markets filled with lentils or oil. Others sit in shrines, holding water that will be sprinkled on altars. A few are used as containers for messages, the way someone might tuck a note into a drawer. Into one of these jars, a grandmother carefully places a scrap of cloth from a newborn's blanket. Whispering a small request, Khanum, shape this one strong in patience and quick in laughter. It is not an official prayer. No priest records it, but the jar sits on a shelf within the god's temple precinct, and divine workshops are known to have excellent acoustics for such things. Dinam is not the only one involved in these quiet negotiations. Nearby, the goddess Satis, associated with the flood's arrival, sometimes looks over his shoulder. She is patient with water's timing. She is patient with clay as well. When she thinks a person might need a bit more flexibility, she suggests softening the mixture. This one will live in a time of changing rulers, she might remark, dropping a figurative drip into the bowl. Let them bend without breaking. Anuket, goddess of the cataracts, curves and currents, occasionally adds a pinch of restlessness to someone's destiny, the way a cook adds spice. Let this one be content in journeys, she murmurs. It is all very collaborative, like a group of artisans working on the same long mural. From the human perspective, all of this shows up as personality. One neighbor is calm, another restless, a third remembers dreams and suspicious detail. The people themselves explain it with stories. She takes after her mother, or he was born during a lucky month, or the 7 Hathors whispered something special at his cradle. They are not wrong. In Egyptian imagination, the gods share tasks and overlap. Khnum shapes bodies and life force. The Hathors whisper fate. Shai notes probability. Renenutet brings the harvest that makes any of it livable. Destiny, like a good pot, has many fingerprints on it. Asterisk, there is a particular quiet habit in some houses. Before bed, someone will touch the clay floor with the palm of their hand and say a small sentence to them, nothing grand. Keep us steady, or help this crack not widen, or shape tomorrow kindly. Children copy the motion, leaving tiny handprints that dry and fade. The gesture is half prayer, half reminder. You are made of the same stuff as the ground beneath you, and the God who shaped you is familiar with repairs. If you feel slightly lopsided, that is not a reason for despair. It is just a note for the next maintenance session, asterisk. In the temple records, scribes sometimes write about Khnum in more official terms. They list his titles: Lord of the Cataract, Father of Fathers, Maker of all bodies. They describe rituals where priests present little jars of Nile water and say formulae that have been memorized for centuries. But underneath the formal language, there is an unspoken understanding that people are thinking of their own very specific crookednesses. A priest intoning, "Make them fashion your limbs anew," is also a person who has tripped on the same step 3 times this week and is secretly hoping the god might file down the metaphorical edge dot as the night moves on. You may notice how often clay appears in these stories. Clay floors, clay lamps, clay jars, clay little gods on shelves. It is practical, plentiful, and forgiving. You can leave a fingerprint on it without meaning to, and that is part of its charm. In a way, Khnum's myth is simply an elevated version of something everyone already knows from daily life, that the materials of a person or a day or a habit can be worked and reworked if you keep them moist with attention and a bit of kindness. Let them dry too fast in harsh judgment and they crack. Keep them endlessly soggy with indecision and they never hold a shape. Somewhere between those extremes is the comfortable firmness of a bowl you can trust not to leak. If you are still awake, you might consider which parts of yourself feel a little too brittle tonight and which feel pleasantly solid. You don't have to fix anything. This is not an inspection with grades. It is more like them turning the wheel slowly, just looking. Perhaps there is a habit that has served you well, but could use a softer edge. Perhaps there is a skill that you have been telling yourself you just don't have, when really it's an area where the clay was left intentionally thick, waiting for future hands, your own included, to refine it. In the myth, the god shapes you once. In practice, you shape yourself many times, with every small choice to loosen or firm your responses. Meanwhile, in the divine workshop, Khnum sets another figure on the shelf and begins a new one. There is no hurry. The human calendar will invent years, months, and feast days. Priests will track them with dutiful precision. Scribes will note lucky and unlucky hours. Khnum moves at the pace of the river carving stone, unconcerned with deadlines. If a life takes longer to settle into its intended form, that is fine. Clay, when kept in a cool place and covered, can wait a very long time. It is not offended by process. The room grows quieter. Even the insects have found places to be. The scribe upstairs has finally put down their pen, blown gently on the last line of text, and gone to rest on a mat that still smells of reeds and sun. In the human pottery house, the wheel has stopped, but the jars cooling on the rack remember the spin in their sides. The grandmother's wish in the jar by the window sits patiently, its words dissolving into the same air that carries all prayers toward whoever is listening. Kanam wipes his hands on a cloth that has seen centuries of destinies pass through it. Though of course cloth is replaced and stories are not. He looks at the shelves, at the trays of spare qualities, at the doorway leading up to the sleeping island. From here, the lives he has shaped are invisible, folded into houses, markets, boats, and fields. He does not see every moment. That would be exhausting, even for a god. But he knows the feel of his work. Somewhere, a person is laughing a little more easily than they might have, thanks to an extra pinch of humor he pressed into their chest. Somewhere else, someone is stepping away from an argument before it hardens, because their clay was mixed with a bit more flexibility on a night like this. You do not have to imagine all of those lives. It is enough to know that your breathing, slow and steady, belongs to the same catalog of gentle motions as Knom's turning wheel. Inhale, and you draw in cool air like a pot draws water. Exhale, and some of the day's sharp edges blur, like clay under the foam. You are not finished, and you do not need to be. The god of the wheel is famously comfortable with works in progress. If you drift off now, mid-thought, mid-sentence, you will simply join the long list of humans who have fallen asleep while the gods were, still shaping little adjustments for tomorrow. The wheel will keep turning without your supervision. The shelves of qualities will be there in the morning, and somewhere in the soft, unhurried space between stories and sleep, the ram-headed potter will keep doing what he always does, smoothing, rounding, adding a tiny bit of balance here, a touch of patience there, until the world feels just solid enough to hold you gently while you rest. Asterisk. You might not expect something as mysterious as fate to live in a filing system, but in Egypt it was perfectly reasonable to imagine destiny stored on shelves, rolled up as papyrus, labeled in neat hands that worried about ink smudges. Somewhere beyond the temples and the rush of the river, when the noise of markets has sunk into the mud and the frogs have taken over the evening announcements, there is said to be a quiet office where the god Shai, who is fate given personality, works like a night clerk who is very good at his job and never in a hurry. If you are still awake a little later, you can decide whether to picture him exactly as described, or let the image drift and blur until it feels like someone else's dream left on your pillow. Both choices will be dutifully noted in a margin somewhere. That is the sort of careful universe you are lying in in that office. The first thing you would notice is not Shai himself, but the shelves. They go up farther than lamplight likes to travel. Each shelf holds rolled papyri tied with colored cords. The colors are not dramatic. No thunderous red for heroes. No midnight black for villains, just patient. Practical shades, river reed green for ordinary days. Pale clay for moments that feel forgettable at the time. A slightly more golden brown for decisions that will later be described as turning points to impress grandchildren. Dust does not settle on these scrolls because dust would imply neglect. Time passes here, but it passes like a librarian making rounds, straightening things that are already straight. At a low table sits Shai. He is not frightening. His face is calm, a little tired in the way of someone who has never once taken a vacation and yet is not resentful about it. In some paintings, he appears as a man, in others as a seated figure holding a life sign, in many as a word written on a line of hieroglyphs. Tonight he is simply present in whatever form lets him hold a reed pen. On one side of the table is a stack of blank sheets. On the other are small baskets of tiny tokens that represent possible events, a miniature fish for unexpected meals, a little flake of copper for coins found in crevices, a sliver of broken pottery for embarrassing moments that will be remembered forever. It is very organized. The universe, at least in this room, runs on good stationery. Every time a child is born along the Nile, somewhere in a village where the roofs still smell of baked mud and fresh thatch, Shai receives a soft notification. There is no loud bell, no flash of divine light, just a simple change in the way the air moves around his table, like a page turning itself. He reaches for a fresh sheet, moistens his pen in a quiet ink pot, and writes a name. Sometimes the name is already decided by the parents. Sometimes he leaves a small space, a gap for a later choice. Human free will is mostly a matter of well-placed blanks. Then he begins to sketch out the long procession of this life, not in full sentences, but in small, suggestive lines. Will learn to balance water jars without thinking. Prefers shade to arguments. Will not enjoy dates with too many seeds. Little things. The big events, the ones that sound dramatic when carved into stone, are often scribbled in later with the same handwriting and almost the same size. Shai is not alone in his late-night work. Renunutet, the goddess of nourishment, harvest, slips in from time to time, smelling faintly of grain and sun-warmed fields. Her task is to make sure that the fate on paper can actually be fed. She leans over a scroll and checks the symbols for years of plenty and years of scarcity, weighing them the way she weighs ears of corn in her hands. This one will need an extra good harvest at 12, she remarks, dropping a grain token onto the sheet. Otherwise, they will give up on trying to grow things. And we need their patience in the southern fields later. Shai nods and adds a small mark, an unexpected overflow of the Nile that year. A bit higher than usual, but not enough to annoy the engineer's dot in another corner. A lesser spirit whose job is mainly filing hums to itself while sorting scrolls into their rows. It is the sort of humming that has no melody and no intention of ending. Occasionally, it pauses to smooth a wrinkle in a papyrus, in the same absent way you might straighten a blanket while already half asleep. The sound of the reed pen, the soft shuffle of scrolls, and that wordless humming weave together into a kind of background music for destiny. It is surprisingly very soothing. If you could read the scrolls, you would find that most of them are made of small, unspectacular moments, threaded together like beads of the same color. A note about learning to tie sandals properly. A mark where someone figures out how much honey is too much honey before sleep. An entry describing the first time a person notices that the shadow of a date palm moves slower than their impatience. Myth tends to remember the rare, bright beads crowns won, wars survived, big miracles signed off by several gods, but Shai copies down almost everything else. It is the smaller events that truly need accounting. The big ones sort of underline themselves. Asterisk. Somewhere in the middle of these stacks is a section for unusual cases, which is about as dramatic as Shai allows himself to be. These are the lives that will cross paths with royal decrees or landmark stele, the ones priests will mention in temple tales. Their scrolls have a little red thread as a bookmark, not because they are more important, but because humans are more likely to ask about them. Thutmose Dreaming by the Sphinx has a file here. So does the scribe who decided which version of that story would be carved on the stone? So does the unnamed worker who sharpened the chisel? Destiny, in Shai's view, is a collaborative project, and everyone gets their own paperwork. Asterisk. On some nights, the god flips gently through these highlighted cases, not to admire them, but to check the margins. He is fond of margins. That is where he adds tiny adjustments, The equivalent of writing may encounter helpful stranger at this point, or consider inserting a cat. Cats, by the way, appear quite often. They are excellent tools for redirecting doom into mild inconvenience. There's a column of tiny cat head glyphs in more than one fate, so small that a casual reader would miss them, but effective. A person steps outside to feed a meowing cat, and thereby narrowly avoids a falling pot. From the human point of view, it is coincidence. From the perspective of this office, it is good use of available resources. Early in the night, Shai's work is more deliberate. His strokes are slow, and he pauses often to think. As the hours drift by and the chill of desert midnight presses against the walls, his movements become easier, almost automatic. He already knows the patterns people favor, the things they will probably do when presented with certain choices. Knowing does not mean forcing, though. For each decision point, he leaves a cluster of possibilities rather than a single arrow. May speak, may stay silent, may change the subject to bread. He does not mind which one you pick. His satisfaction comes from seeing the pattern of your choices form something that fits you. Like a garment you gradually alter until it sits just right every now and then. There is a small mistake. Not a catastrophe, just a clerical hiccup. A fate sheet might receive an extra line meant for someone else. Will be unreasonably frightened by geese, perhaps. Or will have a habit of remembering song lyrics, but not where they put their sandals. When this happens, the filing spirit freezes guiltily and waits for scolding, but Shai only smiles. It's all right, he says. We will see what they do with it. And often enough, the person simply learns to walk a wider path around the geese, or becomes the family member everyone consults when they misplace their sandals. Fate is not fragile glass. It is more like baked clay. It can handle a few uneven edges, closer to dawn, when the sky over Egypt is still dark, but beginning to think about light. Human rituals start to stir that echo what is happening in this unseen office. In houses along the river, mothers wake to feed infants whose futures have been outlined on Shai's table, but not yet colored in by living. They murmur small wishes into soft hair. May you never lack bread. May you be kinder than your uncle. May your work be lighter than mine. These are not official decrees, but the words rise like little curls of incense and curl around the appropriate scrolls. Shai never rejects them. He simply notes them as suggestions from stakeholders and adjusts where he can. Sometimes the gods are less rigid than the people who describe them. Priests in temples recite morning hymns that mention Shai by name, usually in the flattering way, you who determine lifespans, you who allot years, you who know the measure of each day. It sounds very grand, and the stone walls echo the declarations handsomely. Shai, however, hears it more like someone calling roll at the beginning of the school day. Present, yes, still at the desk, still measuring. The important work remains the same, marking, adjusting, smoothing out the path of events so that human lives do not arrive all at once in a pile, but in a sequence that allows for breakfasts and naps and the occasional day off. Among all these scrolls and notes, there is also a small section that very few myths mention. It is the place where Shai keeps the maybe sheets. These are the fates that have not settled yet in any direction, the lives where something significant is still in flux. To human ears, this might sound alarming. To Shai, it is simply interesting. He checks on them regularly, adding tiny updates and pencil-thin lines. Leaning toward courage, leaning toward keeping quiet, leaning toward learning to bake bread with sesame. You may be lying under a blanket now, with such a sheet bearing your name, resting for a moment in the maybe section while the god waits to see how tomorrow feels when it arrives. If the thought of someone tracking your decisions on papyrus feels unsettling, you can imagine that part as more symbolic than literal. The ancient Egyptians themselves probably did both at once. They could picture a god with a pen and also understand that shy meant the way things unfold, the mix of chance and consequence that shapes a life. Our minds like stories as containers for truth. So Shy's office becomes a place to put all the messy bits of existence, the things we choose, the things that happen anyway, the way a single conversation can make a year feel different without anyone really knowing why. It is all easier to think about if you picture a patient clerk lifting his head from the page and thinking, ah, so that's what they did. Asterisk, you can visit that office in imagination without any ceremony. Just think of shelves and paper and a quiet lamp that never quite goes out. See Shy dipping his pen, pausing over your line for today. You walked somewhere. You said something or decided not to. You worried about something that may or may not happen. You laughed once, maybe more. None of it was wasted. Every small motion of feeling and choice is a stroke on the scroll. If you feel that some parts of the day were badly drawn, with lines going in directions you dislike, you can imagine Shy gently smoothing them with the side of his hand, softening the ink so that tomorrow there is room for a different curve. Asterisk. In the far distance of this scene, the great cycle of judgment and afterlife goes on. Hearts will be weighed against Mot's feather. Scrolls will be unrolled in the Hall of Two Truths. Osiris will listen, and all the serious official matters will proceed as the doctrine suggests. Shy appears there too in some paintings, standing near the scales like a quiet accountant, making sure the numbers match. But that is not the mood tonight. Tonight he is only the keeper of the sleepier parts of destiny, the way your habits arrange themselves like pillows, the way your hopes line up like jars on a shelf, the way your worries can be carefully set down for a few hours and left in someone else's in tray. Outside this imagined building, the Nile glides past in the dark. No one stands on the bank to watch it. The fishermen are still dreaming of nets that do not tangle. The river is doing what it always does, going somewhere while also staying itself. A papyrus boat tied to a post taps gently against the wood, as if taking very small breaths. Somewhere, a crocodile surfaces, decides that nothing particularly interesting is happening, and sinks again. The stars over Egypt make their tiny adjustments, moving a fraction to the west, shaking yesterday's dust from their shoulders. None of them feel the need to hurry. The universe has existed quite a long time. It can afford to stroll. Inside, Shy finishes the line he was writing and sets his pen aside. He does not close the scroll. He never really closes any of them. Lives are porous at the edges. Even when a day ends, its ink is still soft enough for the next one to blend with it. He leans back and listens, not with ears, but with the part of himself that exists wherever time is being lived, in your heartbeat, in the soft rush of blood in your ears, in the way your thoughts are gradually spacing themselves farther, apart like stepping stones seen from a boat drifting away. If you choose to imagine asking him a question, before you sleep something simple, like, will everything be all right? He would probably answer with something equally simple and not entirely precise. Everything will be something, he might say, and you will not go through it alone. There will be people and cats and cups of water and unexpected breezes. There will be days that feel heavier and days that feel light. We will keep track. We will adjust. It is not the sort of answer that looks good carved in stone, but it suits a bedtime better than thunder. The lamp on his table burns a little lower. In the houses, dreams begin to thicken like fog gathering in hollows. Somewhere a child, whose fate has just gained a new line about learning to love stories, turns in their sleep and loosens their hold on the day. You can do the same. Let the image of the shelves fade until it is only the idea of things being quietly handled. Let the God with his pen become nothing more than a sense that your life is allowed to be a work in progress. not a test you must pass before the ink dries dot and as your breathing slows. You may forget entirely that there is, in some imagined corner of eternity, a small room where Shy continues to write. That is perfectly fine. The scroll will not mind your absence. It will be there when you wake, ready to receive the next simple line. Woke up, had a thought, took a breath. In a universe that keeps such gentle records, even falling asleep counts as an accomplishment, and right now, with the river moving quietly in the dark and the god of fate filing your day under complete, that is more than enough. Asterisk. You might think that if 7 goddesses came to visit your house, there would at least be a bit of fanfare, some thunder, or a dramatic draft under the door. In Egypt, of course, it is much more sensible. The 7 Hathors slip into a room the way sleep does, without knocking, on a night when a clay lamp is already burning low, and everybody is too tired to make speeches. Somewhere in a small mud brick house, woven mats pressed flat by years of footsteps, a newborn has finally stopped protesting the shock of existence. A mother lies propped on a rolled cloak, counting the baby's breaths because it is the only number in the room that matters. A midwife dozes upright on a stool, her head bobbing like a boat on a very calm tide. Outside, the courtyard has settled. Even the dogs have run out of opinions. This is the hour when myth can enter without anyone thinking it impolite. Dot protection has already been arranged with practical enthusiasm. On the wall above the cradle, someone has painted quick little eyes and nets in black. The way you might stick cheerful stickers on a baby's bedroom today, except these claim to catch bad luck before it can land. A clay hippo amulet shaped like Tauret hangs from a nail, wide-hipped and slightly smug, as if she has seen every kind of household emergency and is not particularly impressed by any of them. There might even be a tiny bass figure tucked near the door, grinning with all the gravity of a protective uncle who also enjoys making faces at infants. All of this is meant to say to danger, as politely as possible, you are not on the guest list. Dot, and yet there are other guests expected, the ones no one talks to directly. At some padded depth of the night, the air in the doorway thickens a little, as though a curtain of perfume has been drawn across it. From that scent honey wine and lotus, a hint of cows and warm milk and incense ash, the 7 Hathors arrive. Sometimes they choose to appear as women, 7 figures wrapped in linen, jewelry whispering against their throats, eyes painted long and cool. Sometimes they choose the shape of sacred cows crowned with the solar disk, their flanks glowing faintly like moonlit fields. Tonight, because the room is small and the ceiling low, they settle somewhere in between, a presence you might glimpse only as a slight deepening of shadow near the walls. A suggestion of horns traced in lamplight if you stare too long. They do not open the door. They do not need to. They step in where the boundary between story and sleep has already thinned. They have done this many, many times. It is their specialty, like a night shift with extremely specific responsibilities. Think of them as 7 aunties in a cosmic group chat, showing up simultaneously in every nursery that needs an update. They do not ask permission. They simply wait until the room feels quiet enough to hear them. The midwife's head dips. The mother's eyes finally close. The baby, who has only just met gravity, surrenders to the steady rhythm of breath. The lamp hums its soft, red circle of light. The house is held so still that even the dust seems to pause in midair. When they speak, their voices are not loud. They sound like different layers of the same lullaby, overlapping gently. One gives the broad strokes, another adjusts the details. A third reminds them of precedents from other households, the way experienced clerks quote previous cases. They have come to do what they always do, to tell a small human, and everyone who loves them, what kind of story they are being born into. Not the whole story, just the outline that will haunt conversations for years, Their prophecies are not full of dragons or sudden lightning. They are simple sentences, the sort you could write on an ostrakhan and tuck into a drawer. This child will travel farther than the village boundary. This, one's hands will be clever with cloth. This, heart will love quickly and heal slowly. The words are chosen from the same vocabulary as daily life. Water means change, bread means stability, roads mean exile or opportunity, depending on how you hear them. Even the tone of voice matters, a promise wrapped in silk or a warning disguised as advice. One Hathor leans closer to the cradle and whispers a line about laughter. Another nods and adds a quiet clause about stubbornness, because the two tend to arrive as a pair. If there is any danger at all in this very well-behaved myth, lies in how the family will hear those words. If the Hathors say, "This child will be taken by the river," meaning perhaps that the river will claim their thoughts, that they will become a boatman or a reed cutter, or simply someone who is always drawn to water, the mother might clutch the blanket tighter and think only of drowning. After that, every time the child splashes at the riverbank, every ripple becomes a sentence beginning. If the Hathors mention greatness, which they do sparingly because it tends to cause more trouble than it's worth, the tiny room can suddenly feel like a training camp. A baby who is perfectly content to gurgle at the ceiling might wake up to find that every choice is now a test. The goddesses do not stay to explain. They plant the seeds of meaning and let human anxiety do the watering. Still, they are not cruel. There is always a softness in their phrasing, a little ambiguity folded in like extra cloth in a garment so that a growing life has room to move. One Hathor might say, "Their days will be long," and leave it to the family to decide whether that means old age, busy schedules, or simply the kind of personality that counts every hour twice. Another might speak of many doors opening, which could mean opportunity, or just a future career as the person everyone tends to check who is knocking. They are careful with timing too. A prophecy that lands too early can bruise, so they often tuck their most precise lines into the pauses between breaths, where only the part of the mother that will remember later, in a half-remembered way, can hear them. Asterisk. When the whispering is done, the Hathors do what all visitors must eventually do. They leave. But even their departure is not dramatic. There's no curtain of wings, no flash of cowtails. The scent at the doorway thins. The room fills back up with ordinary darkness. The midwife snorts herself awake and mutters about checking the bandages. The mother dreams of walking through a field with 7 shadows that refuse to line up with her own. The baby, who has had an utterly normal night by infant standards, wriggles and produces a small, opinionated sound as if protesting the idea of being forecasted. The 7 Hathors are already somewhere else, leaning over another cradle, repeating the same delicate work with new names. Like a song sung on a different note. Morning comes, and with it, the human part of the story, the negotiation phase. No one would call it that out loud, of course. Out loud, people say things like, "We will do our best," and "the gods have spoken." But under those phrases runs an older instinct. If the future has been spoken in words, perhaps it can be nudged with other words, with objects, with tiny daily practices. Families in Egypt are good at tiny daily practices. It is one of their favorite arts. So the mother and father, and perhaps a grandmother with strong opinions, begin to think about amulets. If the Hathors have mentioned love that may hurt, the family might hang a little image of Chariot, the hippo goddess of childbirth and protection, over the bed, not just for the child's body, but for their heart. If there was talk of journeys, someone may suggest a small boat charm, a reminder that even long trips need a safe harbor. Base, the dwarf god with the ridiculous lion mane and the very serious role of protecting households, gets invited in on formal terms, carved onto a headrest, painted on a washing bowl, lurking in corners where he can frighten away anything that plans to take the prophecies too literally. Names become tools too. A child predicted to be restless might be given a name that means peace, the way a particularly energetic cat might be named stillness in a hopeful mood. A baby marked for hardship might receive an extra name in secret, tucked away like a hidden room to confuse any misfortune that comes looking for them. The Egyptians love names the way scribes love fresh ink. They believe that what is named can be negotiated with. Each name is like a handhold carved into the steep wall of fate, something you can grasp when you feel yourself sliding. Offerings begin modestly and stay that way. A little bread set aside at festival time. A splash of beer poured toward the earth with a mutter that is not quite a prayer and not quite a complaint. No one says, we are paying the gods to change their minds, because that would be rude. Instead, they say things like, may it be light upon him, meaning may the difficulties weigh less than expected. Or, may she be like Hathor in sweetness, which sounds like a compliment but is also a gentle reminder to the universe that this specific child has fans willing to make noise on her behalf. Small repairs are the preferred method. You cannot rewrite the whole sentence delivered at the cradle, but you can adjust the punctuation dot and all of this. The midwife becomes a quiet kind of priest. She was there when the 7 Hathors slipped in, and whether she heard them clearly or only in the buzzing of the lamp, people believe she knows more than she says. For the first nights, she sets the rules of the room the way a temple sets rules for its sanctuary. Who may enter? Who must stay outside? Which stories are allowed to be told over the baby's head and which must wait until morning? If the prophecy felt sharp, if the words the family thinks they heard were heavy or frightening, she is the one who insists on routine. Bath, feed, sleep, repeat. One safe habit at a time. It is hard for Panic to stay awake in the presence of a schedule. She reads the baby's cries and kicks with the same attention a priest gives to the smoke from the altar. Not because every movement is an omen, but because every movement is a piece of the child's personal weather. If a line about water taking them was whispered, she watches closely the first time the baby is bathed, not with fear so much as respectful curiosity. When nothing unusual happens, she files that information quietly in her memory and makes sure that, from then on, baths are just baths, not rehearsals for disaster. Boundary to her is medicine. Start time, end time, who holds the child, how many visitors in an hour. She cannot cancel the prophecy, but she can prevent it from moving into the house rent-free. Years unspool like thread from a spindle. The baby becomes a child who has very strong opinions about which side of the mat is theirs. The original words of the Hathors, exactly as they were murmured in the night, would be hard to retrieve now. Human memory is a generous editor. The mother, telling the story to a neighbor over grinding stones, trims the lines to fit whatever has actually happened so far. If the child has turned out cautious, she emphasizes the part about walking carefully. If they are fearless and already trying to climb date palms before breakfast, she swears the goddesses predicted great energy. Both versions feel true to her in different moods. Prophecy becomes a mirror that learns to agree with whichever face is looking into it by the time there is talk of marriage. Or of travel to another city. The cradle scene has been retold so often that it exists in multiple editions. There is the hopeful version used at celebrations. The Hathors smiled on you. They said your life would be full of good things. There is the cautionary version, brought out during arguments. Remember, they warned you about that temper. There is even the comforting version, whispered when things go wrong. They told us there would be hard years, but also that you would not break. In each telling, the goddess's words become a little more aligned with what the family needs them to say. Fate has turned from an announcement into a story people use to navigate their feelings. Asterisk. Some families commemorate the night with a small stele set up in a corner or on the roof, carved with a simple prayer and perhaps 7 little cow heads in a row. The stone does not record the prophecy itself. It records the fact that there was one. The Hathors came, it says in hieroglyphs, and we listened. That gesture is enough to make the memory feel more solid, even as the details keep rearranging themselves. Over the years, dust softens the edges of the carving. Pigeons treat the stele with respectful indifference. Children climb past it on their way to more interesting adventures. But in quiet moments at dawn, or in the blue hour after sunset, somebody will rest a hand on the cool stone and think, this is proof that our lives are being watched by more than just neighbors in everyday practice. People eventually adopt a sort of bedtime oath for their own souls, inspired by those unseen visitors at the cradle. It isn't written down anywhere, but you can hear pieces of it in the way they talk to their children as they fall asleep. Keep worries in one jar, they imply, and joys in another. Do not mix them until you absolutely must. Treat prophecies the way you treat weather reports from the temple astronomers. Good to know, but not worth canceling every plan. Prepare for the flood, but still plant your seeds. Prepare for sorrow, but still teach the baby to laugh. The Hathors, if they are listening, and they usually are, probably approve of this practical theology. Tonight, much later in the cycle of such nights, another baby lies in another house under another painted ceiling. The midwife has grown older, but her hands still move with the same steady competence. She has attended enough births to know that every family believes, secretly, that their cradle is the center of the world. And in a way, for a while, it is. She has also learned that whatever the 7 Hathors say, life will find a way to surprise both humans and goddesses. So she focuses on the tasks she can see, adjusting the blanket, checking the knot that keeps the amulet from tickling the baby's ear, reminding the mother to drink water outside. The neighborhood has its own quiet music, the faint slap of someone closing a courtyard door, a donkey giving its opinion of the hour, frogs practicing their chorus in the irrigation canal. Stars drift over the roof, unhurried. Somewhere, on the other side of the dark, priests are watching them and doing the complicated math that keeps the calendar in step with the sky. The world is full of people trying, in their own ways, to keep up with the future. The 7 Hathors handle the poetic part. Everyone else handles the bedtime part. If you imagine the goddesses again, leaning over yet another cradle, you can picture them with a slightly amused tenderness. They know that whatever they whisper will be embroidered, debated, misheard, quoted incorrectly, and still taken very seriously. They have been doing this since the first families lit the first night lamps. They are not offended by human editing. For them, the beauty lies in the partnership. They offer a line or two, and people spend decades turning it into a whole life, with naps and snacks and market days and private jokes. Destiny in their view is not a finished statue, but a long, slow conversation. So as you listen now, perhaps with your own room dim and quiet, you can borrow a little of that Egyptian habit. Imagine that the 7 Hathors visited you once, or will visit you tonight, not with booming declarations, but with gently phrased suggestions. Try kindness, one might murmur. Leave room for rest, another might add, sounding suspiciously like a modern sleep expert. A third could whisper, remember that you do not have to understand everything at once. You do not have to decide whether these lines are literally true. It is enough to let them drift through your thoughts like soft wind through palm leaves. Let the painted eyes on your walls reel, or imagine stand guard for a while. Let your worries take a number and sit politely on a bench outside the door. Inside, the room of your own night can become like that ancient nursery, a space where breathing is the only schedule that truly matters, where stories about the future are allowed to be unfinished. and where 7 unseen listeners are more interested in your comfort than in your achievements. Somewhere between one breath and the next, the Hathors turn their faces toward your resting mind. Note that you are finally beginning to loosen your hold on the day, and nod to one another in quiet approval. They will be back. Of course, whenever another cradle appears, whenever another human heart starts beating its particular rhythm, their work does not end. But for tonight in the deep, calm hours when even the frogs have started repeating themselves, their whispers thin out into a gentle silence. The lamp of your attention burns lower. The story can go on without you for a while. You can let it. The night goddesses are still watching the door. Asterisk. If you were a newborn in ancient Egypt, the first official visitors to your room were not neighbors bringing lentils or cousins arguing about who the baby resembles. Very often, according to the stories, your earliest guests were 7 quiet goddesses who preferred to arrive when the lamp was low, the floor was cool, and everyone who might panic was already half asleep. They are called the 7 Hathors, and their job description is oddly specific. They come to look at your face, listen to your breath, and then whisper a few lines about the kind of life you're going to have. No thunder, no smoke, just a sort of cosmic bedtime commentary. If by some miracle you are still awake in a few minutes, you can decide whether that sounds comforting or whether you would like to unsubscribe from destiny entirely. Most people simply drift off and let the goddesses talk. Picture a small house at the edge of a village, the mud brick walls giving off the day as stored heat like a polite oven that has no plans to turn off quickly. A red lamp hangs in one corner and pushes a soft glow over the plaster, over the little painted symbols that someone has. Brushed onto the wall above the cradle, eyes with neat lashes, simple nets, a tiny sign for life. They are not elaborate temple scenes, just quick strokes from a hand that has ground grain all day and still found enough energy to paint projections before dark. The courtyard outside has settled. The chickens are folded into themselves. A dog sighs and resigns the night to the insects. This is the hour when even noise seems to move more slowly. Inside, a mother lies on a reed mat, propped with a rolled cloak, a little stunned by the fact that her heart now seems to live outside her body and the small person beside her. A midwife sits on a stool near the doorway, her hair wrapped, her posture upright out of habit, even though her eyes keep closing. She has done this many times, and she knows the sounds of a healthy infant, the way fishermen know the voices of the river. The baby sleeps in a basket lined with linen, breathing in small gusts as if practicing for future sighs. Someone has tucked a clay hippo figure above the doorway, Torah with her wide hips and patient smile, and a little figure of Bess near the bed, tongue sticking out, lion mane bristling in case anything unfriendly tries to comment on the child. It is precisely when everything reaches this fragile balance of quiet that the 7 Hathors arrive. They do not knock. Doorways to them are suggestions. The red lamp wavers for a moment as if someone has exhaled close to the flame. The air in the room thickens with a hint of perfume, lotus and beer, and a sweetness like warm milk left near a hearth. If you were wide awake, you might say, the goddesses are here. But humans are more efficient than that. Most of the time, they simply feel their shoulders unknot and assume the day is finally, mercifully over. In some tales, the Hathors step in as women, 7 figures with bracelets whispering along their arms, linen smooth as well-made papyrus, hair heavy with beads. In others, they appear as cows with shining horns and little solar discs crowning their foreheads, their eyes liquid and calm. Tonight, they choose something in between, a presence that barely suggests hooves on the packed earth, a glow along the ceiling beam like distant moonlight. They stand, or whatever the divine equivalent of standing is, around the cradle and look at the sleeping child, the way experienced scribes study a blank ostrakhan, ready to write, but in no hurry. The first scene of their visit is always the same. The house itself feels held in a gentle grip. The mother's breath slows. The midwife's chin sinks slowly toward her chest. Outside, the wind takes a break from arranging sand and leans against the wall to listen. For just a little while, the ordinary world is politely asked to wait in the courtyard while something more delicate happens inside. It is not dramatic, only strangely still, as if the whole night is taking care not to wake the baby. One Hathor steps a fraction closer, tracing invisible patterns in the air above the child, as though measuring the distance between eyebrows, the shape of the tiny mouth, the rhythm of those earnest little breaths. Another tilts her head as though listening to the soft drum of the newborn heart. They do not discuss their impressions out loud. They have been doing this for a very long time and can, like siblings who share a kitchen, communicate with almost no movement at all. Somewhere among them, consensus forms. Somewhere in the space between the baby's inhale and exhale, they begin to decide what to say. When they finally speak, it is not in thunderous lines destined to be carved in stone. It sounds more like overlapping murmurs, like several lullabies being hummed at once in the next room. Their prophecies, according to the old stories, are surprisingly practical. One might say, in words that barely disturb the air, this one will have a voice that people listen to, and another will softly add, though not always as quickly as they should. A third might comment on the child's hands, good for weaving, good for writing, good for holding on. None of them announces, this will be the hero you've all been waiting for, because honestly, that would be a lot of pressure for a person who cannot yet focus on their own fingers. They choose their metaphors carefully. Water, in their language, often means change or travel, a life where the banks of the Nile will not always be enough. Bread means steadiness, a dependable daily rhythm, the kind of person others trust to show up on time with exactly the right amount of grain. A road may be a promise or a warning depending on how the sentence is balanced. They know that human ears will stretch their words, pull them into shapes that sometimes have very little to do with the original intent. So they pack their lines with enough softness that a life can bend without breaking. And yet, even goddesses underestimate how dramatic humans can be. If the Hathors mention that the river will know this child, perhaps thinking of peaceful afternoons in a fishing skiff or a future marriage to someone who works the canals, the family may hear something entirely different. Taken by the river, someone remembers later, and suddenly every ripple, every bit of floating reed is suspicious. If the prophecies include a hint of greatness, the word glows like a coal in the back of everyone's mind. A baby who might have simply become a decent potter is now, in theory, a future legend. Every tantrum becomes potential evidence of a strong will. Every clumsy mistake is, somehow, only natural for someone destined for big things. The Hathors, who have already moved on to the next cradle by the time the child is old enough to throw anything, are blissfully unaware of the motivational speeches being built around their carefully measured phrases. Their visit leaves no obvious trace. The lamp burns a little lower. The midwife wakes with a tiny jerk and decides to check the bandage knot again. The mother blinks and wonders if she drifted off. The baby makes one short, indignant sound, as if protesting being forecast, and then descends back into whatever kind of dream a one-day-old can manage. Status returns to normal, which in a house with a newborn still includes sudden crying, spilled water, and people tripping over each other in the dark. The 7 Hathors slip away like the scent of incense, carrying their notes about another completed visit. What remains behind is not exact words, but impressions. Humans remember tone better than transcripts. The mother thinks of the night as peaceful, which to her means that the Hathors must have spoken kindly. The midwife, who woke up with her heart pounding from a dream she can't quite recall, privately suspects the goddess who favors warnings had a stronger voice than usual. The grandparents, who were not in the room at all, will build their version of events from bits. and pieces, adding their own interpretations until eventually the story of the cradle is as polished as a frequently handled stone. The second scene of this quiet myth unfolds in the days and weeks that follow, when everyone begins to act as though fate can be reasoned with, bartered with, lovingly nagged into better behavior. They never say it that way, of course. Out loud, they speak in the respectful phrases that make daily life in Egypt feel like an ongoing negotiation with the invisible. May the gods lighten it, if the goddess wills. Let the good fortune of Hathor stay in this house. Underneath, though, there is a much more familiar motive. Let's see what we can do about this. The most visible tools are the amulets. A tiny bead carved like an eye to see danger before it arrives. A small figure of Tauret, hippo belly, and lion's paws hung near the child's bed, so nightmares know they will be heavily outnumbered. A strip of linen with a knot tied in it, looped around the wrist to strengthen the bond between body and life. These are not decorations. Each one is a side comment in the ongoing conversation with the Hathors. We heard you, they say, and we are adding some footnotes. If the prophecies seem to lean toward illness, they might choose amulets that promise health. If it leaned toward wandering, they might emphasize safe return. Names serve the same purpose. A child whose fate involves storms might receive a name like Calm or Peaceful Day, a daily reminder to the universe that the family has preferences. Offerings are the gentlest form of bargaining. A small bowl of milk set aside before anyone drinks. A crust of bread placed on the threshold with a murmured thanks. At festivals, perhaps a little extra beer dedicated to the Hathors, poured out with a smile that says, without saying it, if you have any flexibility in your schedule, we'd love a few more good harvests. The idea is not to buy a new destiny, but to soften the edges of the existing one. It's a bit like slipping extra padding under a mat, is going to see heavy use. Throughout all of this, the midwife continues to hold a special, almost priestly role. She was there the night of the visit, and whether she heard actual words or only dreamed of whispers, everyone treats her as a kind of translator between the divine and the domestic. For the first week, she enforces a ritual of ordinary days, feeding, changing, resting, repeating. If the prophecy sounded frightening, if someone has decided that the Hathors hinted at loss or struggle, her prescription is quietly stubborn. Regular baths, regular swaddling, regular songs. Fear, she knows, dislikes routine. It prefers chaos, gaps, and sleeplessness. So she fills the house with predictable moments the way a temple fills its halls with incense. She also polices the conversations that happen within earshot of the cradle. No talking about death in the same sentence as the baby's name. No dramatic gasps about ominous dreams where anyone in swaddling can hear them. If necessary, she will simply change the subject with the practiced skill of someone who has redirected many nervous parents. Yes, the Hathor spoke, but have you seen how good this child's grip is? Look at that. In that moment, the plump little fist clutching her finger becomes its own kind of prophecy, one grounded in muscles and present time. The third, slowest scene stretches over years. The cradle becomes a bed. The painted eyes on the wall fade. The amulets are moved to new locations or sewn into clothing. The story of the night when the 7 Hathors came does not fade. It develops versions. At family gatherings, someone will say, they told us from the start that this one would have a quick tongue. And everyone nods at a child who has just argued eloquently about not wanting to fetch water. Another day, after a difficult season, the same prophecy might be remembered as a warning. The Hathors said there would be hard words, and here we are. Memory is a generous sculptor. It smooths away the pieces that no longer fit and accentuates those that match reality. Sometimes a good marriage or a lucky escape from illness is assigned directly to the goddesses. They smiled on you at the cradle. Someone murmurs as bracelets are fastened or as the recovered person steps back into sunlight. Other times, when plans fall apart or grief arrives, people fall back on the idea that the Hathors warned them. They told us there would be tears, they say, perhaps forgetting that tears are included by default in almost every human life. In this way, the prophecy becomes a second skin for the story of the family, worn and mended and re-embroidered to fit each new decade. Out of all these tellings emerges a quiet habit, almost like a personal ritual for the future. Parents who once stayed up worrying over their own prophecies become grandparents who talk differently to sleeping babies. Sitting near a new cradle, they might stroke a small forehead and say something like, "May your fate be light, but even if it isn't, may you always find a place to rest." They have learned through long experience that the details of what the Hathors said matter less than the way people hold those words. A gentle grip hurts less than a clenched fist. The last scene of the myth does not happen in temples or during festivals. It happens at bedtime in hundreds of houses across hundreds of years. A child curls up on a mat, wrapped in a faded blanket that once belonged to an older sibling. The sky outside is the same sky that watched the cradle years ago, just with more stories written in it. The parent or caretaker sitting nearby may or may not believe that 7 goddesses personally attend every birth, but they have still inherited the shape of that belief. They know that words spoken in the dark have weight, so they make a small oath, not aloud and not always consciously. It goes something like this: we will keep the heavy things outside the door until morning if we can. We will keep sharp words away from the sleeping mind. We will store our fears in one mental jar and our hopes in another, and try not to mix the labels. We will interpret any prophecies, old ones, new ones, the things teachers say, the things strangers predict on bad days, in the kindest possible way that still feels honest. We will treat the future as a guest that may arrive with both gifts and inconveniences, but we will still make the bed for it. It is a very Egyptian approach to destiny, respectful, organized, mildly stubborn. The 7 Hathors, wherever they are, seem to have inspired not only stories, but also a philosophy of low-drama resilience. Life will do what life does, they seem to say, but you can choose how you arrange the amulets on the wall, how you pour the milk, how you tuck someone in so that fear has to stand very politely in the courtyard and wait. As you listen, perhaps in your own room with its own modern equivalent of painted eyes and protective trinkets, you can borrow that bedtime oath for yourself. You can imagine that somewhere long ago, 7 calm figures stood at your cradle too, looked at you for a long, thoughtful moment, and then chose words with more care than you will ever know. Maybe they spoke of long journeys, or maybe they simply said, "Let this one find enough warmth and enough rest." You do not need to chase the meaning of their sentences. The sentences have been chasing you all your life and seem content to keep jogging at a respectful distance. Now, the lamp, whatever passes for a lamp near you, has burned down a little. The world outside your walls is still rehearsing its worries, but they are muffled, as if heard from across a courtyard. Inside, your breathing has its own steady rhythm. If there are Hathors anywhere nearby, they are probably leaning against the threshold, satisfied that for this moment at least, you are not urgently consulting the future. You are simply lying there, like the newborn in the basket, held for a while by a room that has decided to be still. The myth does not really end. It just thins out into the background of ordinary nights. Somewhere, another child is being born. Another family is painting small eyes on a fresh wall. Another midwife is nodding off on a stool. The 7 Hathors, as always, are making their rounds, speaking in low voices, wrapping lives in sentences soft enough to sleep in. And you, somewhere between waking and dreaming, can let their habit become yours. Let the story continue without conclusion. Let the future fold itself quietly, and let your thoughts wander more and more slowly, until they, like the courtyard dogs and the red lamp and the goddesses at the door, decide that for now, it is enough simply to rest.